Good afternoon, good morning, good time of the day to everybody, depending on where in the world you are. I know we are still having people enter into the webinar, so I'm going to start slowly. And you can see we have our screen up. So my name is Ingrid Coetzee. I'm the Director of Biodiversity, Nature and Health at ICLEI's Global Cities Biodiversity Centre. I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa, but I work globally. And it's a real pleasure for me today to start this webinar and to welcome you all and to say thank you so much for joining us. For some of you, it might be very late. For others, it might be very early. And really what we're wanting to do today is just talk about localizing biodiversity action under the CBD. And it's part of our series in the lead up to the CBD COP17 in Yerevan, Armenia later this year, which we've titled Navigating the Convention on Biological Diversity, What Local and Subnational Governments Need to Know. This is something that we are doing in partnership with a number of organizations. You can see them all listed at the bottom there. So besides ICLEI, obviously also the Convention on Biological Diversity, our partner Regions 4, IUCN, UNEP, CAL-GBA, as well as the European Committee of the Regions. I also just want to make the point that we're very proud to be able to say that this webinar series of ours is part of the CBD's Communities of Practice, which they instituted to really mainstream biodiversity as per decision 1613. And it's really about showing the world out there and giving opportunity to experts, to practitioners, to parties, to stakeholders, as well as local and subnational governments to explore how to best mainstream biodiversity into sectoral action, but also across government. So before I introduce the speakers and hand over to our moderator for today, I just need to explain a few housekeeping rules. And the first is that, as you probably heard as you came in, the session will be recorded. And by joining the webinar, we understand that you agree to it being recorded. We do this because we do share the recordings via our YouTube site and our website so that people can listen to it afterwards. Those people that are in time zones that are not amenable to being able to join us here in person. Secondly, you will also notice that as participants, you will remain muted, and that we do just to avoid any undue disturbance to our speakers and our panelists. And although our time is limited and we will not have a formal Q&A session, what we do encourage is for you to, if you have any questions or you'd like to make a comment, please use our chat facility at the bottom of your screen. You'll see there's a little chat box. You're welcome to write it in there. If you want to pose a question to a specific panelist or speaker, then all I ask you do is just put their name in there, and then it's easy for us to then direct it to them. If we have time at the end, we'll do it at the end. Otherwise, what we normally do is we just watch our time, and if we see there are so many questions, then we get the speakers just to pop in a written response to your question. So with this, what I want to do now is to just introduce our speakers for today. As you can see on the screen, we're talking about localizing biodiversity action under the CBD. And we're going to be looking at how national and subnational governments and local governments are collaborating to implement the global biodiversity framework, as well as the plan of action on engaging local and subnational governments. Particularly as we are heading this year, we are going to be reporting on the global review of collective progress at COP17. So our speakers now, and maybe I can just ask my tech team to put up the next slide. We have hopefully 4 speakers. We have Alyssa Fisher. She is the head of international advice with the Joint Nature Conservation Committee in the Government of the United Kingdom. And then we have Susan Campbell, who's the Biodiversity Policy Manager from the Biodiversity Unit in the Natural Resources Division at the Government of Scotland. We also have from South Africa, we have Sabelo Nkosi, who's the Senior Manager on Biodiversity Planning at the City of Durban. And hopefully we will be joined by a colleague from our National Ministry of Environment, Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. Her name is Mukondi Machusa. She's a Chief Director of Biodiversity Management in the department. She did indicate to us before our webinar that the department is busy with oversight visits in the very northern parts of the country, and they have very poor Wi-Fi connection. So she may actually not be able to physically join us this afternoon. And then also especially a word of welcome to our moderator, and she is Eva Guria. She leads on partnerships and external relations at the Global Coordination Unit in the NBSAP Accelerator Partnership. And with this, I'm going to hand over to you, Eva. It's all yours. Thank you.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you, Ingrid. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. And it's a pleasure to be moderating today's discussion. And thank you for the invitation on behalf of the NBSAP Accelerator Partnership. Very briefly, as some of you may know, the accelerator works with countries to accelerate implementation of their NBSAPs, their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And we do this by connecting governments with technical, financial, and knowledge partners, promoting coordination across sectors and across levels of government, and helping translate commitments into concrete action. And that's why today's conversation speaks directly to that mission, Ingrid. Because as you have shared, well, national governments establish biodiversity strategies and commitments, but really implementation ultimately happens in cities, in municipalities, in regions and landscapes. And that is why today's discussion is so important. So I'd like to start today's discussion by exploring the theme of governance with Alyssa Fisher. So Alyssa, the Global Biodiversity Framework calls for a whole of government approach, but really making that a reality remains challenging for many countries. So in the UK example, the governance system requires coordination across national and local authorities, but it is also decentralized. So could you share some lessons from your experience in the UK to help operationalize this idea of whole of government approach and really enable some national governments to take local biodiversity action? Thank you, Alyssa. Over to you, and you have 3 minutes.
Sure thing. Thanks, Eva. It's a pleasure to meet you and to speak with everyone today. In the UK, we have a particularly complicated ecosystem for environmental policy, as Eva was saying, because in the UK, the environment is devolved to the countries. And what this means is, though the UK is party to the CBD, the 4 countries of the UK, Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, Wales, the UK's 14 overseas territories and 3 crown dependencies are each responsible for setting their own environmental goals and targets, creating their own policies and legislation, developing their own implementation plans and enforcement mechanisms. And that's not even touching the many cities and local governments with critical implementation roles, different economic contexts, different development priorities. And so in my role leading JNCC's international advice team, I work with all of these different governments and agencies as a convener and as a facilitator. And, the core of our mission, of my team's mission, is twofold. On the one hand, our job is to ensure that as the United Kingdom, we're making progress against global targets and we're improving biodiversity for the future. But on the other hand, our job is really to ensure that the communities that constitute the UK, which are incredibly diverse, spanning as far south as the Falkland Islands and the British Antarctic Territory, to as far north as Scotland and the islands of Shetland and Orkney, from the sunny Caribbean territories like Turks and Caicos and Montserrat, all the way to Pitcairn Island in the South Pacific. So these communities, their ecosystems, their historical contexts are as varied and diverse as one could potentially imagine. And trying to condense all of that diversity down into one national position can be really challenging. Now, I've been working with subnational governments for 15, 20 years. Before I joined JNCC, I worked with cities on every continent to support their engagement in international environmental policy processes. And what I've come to understand is whether small cities, megacities, countries, small island territories, subnational actors really need to be involved from the start of any conversation, whether that's negotiations at a COP, developing indicators and reporting on progress, or developing plans for coordinated implementation. It's really critical to engage subnationals from day one. And, it's not easy. It's definitely more complicated and can slow down the process, which is sometimes difficult to balance against the tight timescales of negotiations, but it's really critically important. We find that when we work together with subnational governments to understand their unique contexts, to learn about the innovative solutions they're developing, our outcomes are always better. And we need to engage subnationals from the start. We need to build strong and genuine and trusted relationships to expose real issues and solve them together. We need to have regular conversations throughout the year, not just a one and done presentation before every milestone. Our implementation plans really are that much more nuanced and achievable when they're informed by the priorities of the communities that actually have to deliver them. And we can't wait until, the week before the COP or the final draft has been written to request those inputs and those feedback from subnational governments. We need to start working together, as I say, on day one, or we're missing a massive opportunity for impact.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. And I'm very impressed with your timekeeping, I have to say, just as the 3-minute mark on my phone started to ring. So fantastic. Thank you very much, Alyssa. And that really highlights how governance arrangements really create the enabling conditions for implementation, without which we will not have progress on the NBSAP. So thank you very much. So now I'd now like to turn to Scotland, to Susan Campbell. So Susan, one issue we hear repeatedly is that local governments often want to contribute to national and global processes, but they don't always have clear pathways for participating in national planning and reporting. So as representative of Scotland, the driving force behind the Edinburgh process and the recognition of subnational governments within the CBD. And as we move towards reporting on the first global review at COP17, the CBD COP17 in October, to what extent was Scotland consulted and its contributions integrated into the national biodiversity planning, monitoring, and reporting system? And further, do you have any practical advice on steps to ensure the regional government's contributions are more effectively integrated? Susan, over to you. You have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva, and lovely to participate in this webinar today from Edinburgh. So really, as the global biodiversity framework was emerging, we didn't stop and wait for that to happen. We were working already to develop our new biodiversity framework, which consists of a strategy, an overarching strategy, a delivery plan, and statutory targets, in order that we could drive forward action for biodiversity at national and local levels. And we knew that to deliver a nature positive and climate resilient Scotland, that we needed the input of those who know and manage our land and seas best. So that biodiversity framework, that delivery plan, was developed in partnership with our delivery agencies for environment and for nature, We have 32 local authorities in Scotland and 2 national parks in Scotland, and they all come together under one umbrella. So we involved that umbrella organisation, as well as environmental organisations and our farmers, our fishers and our foresters. So we helped pull together the strategy, the delivery plan, and we consulted on that draft plan. We had a public consultation on that draft plan. So when we talk about the whole of society, we made sure that we included the whole of society within that plan. And our final delivery plan for biodiversity was published in 2024. And all of the actions in that plan are assigned with delivery owners responsible for implementation. And some of those are our local authorities, some sit across government. And we work with all those delivery owners to make sure that delivery is on track and to help with implementation. And we've developed a monitoring and evaluation process for our biodiversity delivery plan, which draws upon many of the indicators that are set out in the Global Biodiversity Framework, monitoring and evaluation framework, plus other measures that we've developed in Scotland to help track progress. And we track progress annually. So we collate information from our local authorities and we report that every 3 years to Scottish Parliament. So there's accountability from Scottish ministers for that delivery. And those ministers are our elected representatives. So in turn, they're accountable to the wider public. So again, we have that whole of society approach within our accountability. And in parallel to our biodiversity plan, we've also developed an adaptation plan for Scotland, which includes around 1/3 of the same actions that are in our biodiversity delivery plan. And this recognises the really important role that nature plays for helping us adapt to our changing climate in Scotland. And we've also got a monitoring and evaluation framework for that adaptation plan, which draws upon some of the same biodiversity indicators. So our local authorities are really key in pulling together the information that we need to report on both those monitoring and evaluation frameworks. And we report our adaptation plans annually. So our biodiversity plans every 3 years, our adaptation plans annually. So it's very easy for policymakers, for our local authorities, and for anybody interested to see what progress is being made to ensure that we've got climate resilient places across Scotland, and to look at what we're doing with respect to nature-based solution and nature restoration. And we've managed to synergise climate and biodiversity across Scottish Government, bringing policy areas together to address real climate risks, which are existing already in Scotland and which we anticipate will emerge in Scotland. And the other thing that we're doing is looking to introduce statutory targets for both biodiversity and climate adaptation to help drive forward delivery of the actions that we need to take. And we're using experts to help us develop those targets.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Susan. We will have a little bit more time to go into detail in the second round of questions, but really your experience reminds us that ambition only becomes meaningful when it is backed by the institution. The capacity and sustained investment, including, as you mentioned, the proper accountability with a whole of society approach. So thank you very much for sharing your experience, Susan. And now I'd like to go over to, I'd like to go over to Sabelo. So Sabelo, we've heard about national system. So now I'd like to zoom into the city level. Let's talk about Durban. So how is your city translating the global biodiversity targets and national priorities on biodiversity into local decisions on land use, on service delivery, on economic development? And further, building on what Susan shared, how are you measuring whether those actions are actually making a difference? So Sabelo, over to you. You have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Eva. Yeah, just to acknowledge, I think, the previous speakers, everyone else was here, but also thank you for the invitation to be here. I think, yeah, as the eThekwini municipality, which is city of Durban, how we've translated this is that we have really have developed a municipal open space plan, like short, which is MOS or the Durban Metropolitan Open Space System. And essentially, we do that using a systematic conservation assessment approach, which means that we're relying on national vegetation types, status, threatened species. So really, I think to help us to pull all of that together for us within a global biodiversity hotspot. So I think once for us, we've got this plan, the Durban Metropolitan Open Space System, which then informs our land use planning in that we have integrated the environmental spatial plan into our strategic development framework for the city, which is a legal requirement in terms of planning legislation, but also we've integrated it into our land use scheme as a controlled development area, which means that for any land use applications or land use changes, in that there has to be a consideration of biodiversity related issues, of which there are a number of databases that actually inform that spatial plan, which we are then able to drill down at property or F level to really, I think, make meaningful environmental release biodiversity a contribution. I think the other thing which is quite unique for us being in the planning context is that we have a permanent seat as part of our municipal planning tribunal. So as much as we provide comments, but also we do have a seat where we are a member of the planning tribunal to ensure that all the environmental or biodiversity issues are taken into consideration when we are doing planning, but also where we inform cities' infrastructure developments. I think in essence, really, I think with our plan, I see it as a guiding development within the city, in that we do have what would be an inquiry process, like for the public, which would be for landowners as well as developers. So really, I think it's about identifying your key biodiversity issues that may need to be addressed as part of economic development projects. I think also we use the Durban Metropolitan Open Space System, I think, to help us from a prioritization perspective for our implementation tools. We have a range of these, whether it's around restoration, invasive alien species management, the community reforestation, land acquisition, biodiversity stewardship, as well as where we implement our environmental zones. So in terms of how we are measuring, of which I think that is quite an important thing. I was also just intrigued hearing with Susan in terms of how they measure it. From our perspective, essentially most of this information it's special information, which is every quarter where we update our databases. But then once a year we produce what is known as annual states of biodiversity report, where each year we do track, especially in terms of what has been formally protected and formally managed. So our open space system, it is currently about 95,000 hectares in size, which is about a third of the total municipal area. And we know, based on our tracking and reporting, that only about 7.48% is formally protected and just over 13% is formally managed. I really think this I think also gives us a point of reflection if you compare the global biodiversity framework targets around 30% in terms of the enormous work that we still need to do to try and get towards it. I think in wrapping this up there, Eva, is that I do think that these actions are making a difference, but clearly I think progress is slow if you make that comparison. But I really think what is key for subnational government is really, I think it's having that ambition, but also I think the commitment towards biodiversity in decision making.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much, Sabelo. Your reflections really highlight that cities are where global biodiversity ambitions ultimately become tangible improvements in people's lives via, for example, the systematic conservation approaches, or even implementing the thinking around the planning tribunals. So essentially more of a comprehensive understanding of what implementation means. So thank you very much, Sabelo. So colleagues, moving right on to our second round of questions. And I'd like to focus on what it will take to accelerate implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. As we approach, as you know, COP17 in October, and the Global Biodiversity Framework's first global review. And Alyssa, let me start with you again. And as you know, the global review will assess collective progress rather than individual country performance. But how can national governments create stronger incentives for cities, regions, businesses, and other stakeholders to really commit to action that will strengthen the overall picture of progress and accelerates overall implementation towards 2030? So over to you, Alyssa. You have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Eva. I think the first thing to recognize, sorry, is my audio all right? Yeah, okay. I had to open the window. It was getting quite warm in here and I could hear a motorcycle going by outside. I wasn't sure if you could hear that. All right, super. So thanks for that question, Eva. I think, the first thing that we want to recognize is that the global review is designed to assess collective progress and not individual country performance, because it really reflects a reality that we're all very familiar with. Achieving the KMGBF is not something that national governments can do by themselves. The recent IPBES Nexus and transformative change assessments really reinforced that point. Both of them highlighted that biodiversity outcomes are highly dependent on decisions that are made across multiple sectors at multiple levels of government and society. And so the question for national governments isn't really how do we deliver, it's more how do we enable others to deliver. So I'd like to highlight 4 more practical approaches. The first is that we need to create an enabling environment through policy, regulation, and finance. Now, I don't need to tell this audience that cities and regions are often ready to act, but they need policy certainty and a better understanding, a more clear understanding, rather, of how their efforts contribute to national and global goals. One lesson from the Edinburgh process is about the importance of really aligning those national, regional, and local actions around shared objectives, around shared reporting frameworks. In practice, that can mean integrating biodiversity into areas like spatial planning, infrastructure, climate adaptation, water management. But it also means giving local authorities the mandate and the flexibility to develop the right solutions that will work in their unique contexts, and not taking a blanket one-size-fits-all kind of approach. Second, we need to focus on making biodiversity relevant to the issues that local leaders are already prioritizing. The Nexus assessment reminds us that biodiversity is deeply and inherently connected to climate resilience, to water security, food systems, health, and economic well-being. And for many city leaders, biodiversity becomes so much more tangible when we talk about reducing flood risk, creating healthier communities, improving quality of life, supporting green jobs, or, particularly relevant today, making cities more resilient to extreme heat. Embedding biodiversity within those wider priorities can help us to build broader support for that collaborative action. Third, we need to help local actors access the resources that they need. Finance matters, yes, but it's not only about, I should say, national governments funding projects directly. It's also about helping local governments access finance, creating new innovative blended financing mechanisms, improving access to biodiversity data and metrics, supporting the development of nature-based solutions, and at the end of the day, providing the certainty that gives business, investors, and subnationals the confidence to engage, to implement, and to invest. And finally, we need to invest in capability and data and partnerships. Because as we know, many of the barriers to implementation aren't really about ambition or about knowing what to do. They're about capacity and coordination. Cities, regions, businesses, indigenous peoples, local communities all bring significant expertise and significant implementation capacity. And national governments can really unlock all of that potential by supporting collaboration, supporting and providing technical assistance, and really creating venues for shared learning. So if I had one takeaway, it would be this. The most effective national governments aren't just implementers, they're really enablers of collective action. The strongest incentives that we see aren't a single regulation or a single funding stream, but rather a combination of policy certainty, institutional support, access to finance, and strong partnerships. And if we can create those really critical enabling conditions, cities, regions, businesses, communities, they won't just be contributing to implementation, they'll really be driving that transformative change we need to reach 2030 goals.
Wonderful. No, thank you, Alyssa. Really, your reflections reinforce that multi-level governance is ultimately about creating the right incentives, as you mentioned, the enabling environment, not just the right institutions. It's the only way we can enable an all-of-society approach to deliver the GBF. And as you said, enable collective action. So thank you for sharing these words. Now over to Susan. Susan, many regions have declared ambitious biodiversity goals. But as we know, implementation often depends on, and as Elisa was sharing, on financing and institutional coordination. So what has Scotland learned about creating these enabling conditions that turn biodiversity ambition into delivery on the ground? Over to you, Susan. Thank you. You have 3 minutes.
Thanks, Eva. I really endorse everything that Elisa said there, and just maybe to kind of exemplify that or give a practical example. I mentioned before that we recognise the expertise in forestry, farming and fisheries that plays a role for making Scotland a nature positive and climate resilient place. And so we've really tried to help provide specific funding streams that those different sectors can access. So for example, our forestry grant scheme provides funding for woodland creation and really promotes the planting of native species. And our Scottish Marine Environment Enhancement Fund supports projects such as seagrass restoration, which can help our coastal areas, but also conserve species such as oysters and mussels, which are important for Scotland. And really resulting from the Edinburgh process, which you talked about earlier, Scottish ministers committed to providing £65 million of funding over 5 years through what we termed a Nature Restoration Fund. And this funding was split into 2 streams. We've provided monies directly to local authorities to undertake nature restoration for the priorities that they've identified in their own areas. And that goes back to what Sabella was talking about, identifying, local and supporting local priorities. But we've also got a competitive funding stream that enables partnerships to develop between local authorities, brings in community groups, public bodies, environmental organisations, and interested individuals to work together on projects that address those local priorities for both climate and nature. And actually, although the commitment was £65 million over 5 years, ministers provided £75 million into that fund. And that's enabled the creation of new woodlands and wetlands. It's enabled existing areas, biodiversity-rich areas to be enhanced. And it's allowed local authorities to develop and implement their nature networks. And nature networks is the name that we're given in Scotland to having ecologically connected habitats. So that's target 3 in the Global Biodiversity Framework. And local authorities are mapping out what that connectivity could look like within their area of competence. And they're using the Nature Restoration Fund to put in place projects that contribute to that nature network. And they're also working across boundaries to make sure of regional connectivity. And we have mechanisms such as our Climate Ready Regions partnerships and biodiversity partnerships that enable that regional connectivity. But I've talked about government funding streams, and those are really helpful to provide kind of short-term funding for individual projects. We've also developed a natural capital funding stream, which is called it's called the Facility for Investment Ready Nature in Scotland, or FERNS for short. And that helps to bridge the gap between an idea and an investment-ready proposition that's capable of attracting private finance. So as an example, we've got groups of farmers coming together in the northeast of Scotland that are trying to address a real climate risk that they're facing now around drought and soil erosion. And Scotland's known for its rain, so we're not commonly known as a country that deals with water loss and drought. So there's drought, there's soil erosion, and that's affecting farm businesses now. So by working together, 14 farmers have created new wetlands, they've restored rivers, and they've enhanced ecological connectivity through the improvement of existing hedgerows and planting new hedgerows. And they're also tackling non-native species across the landscape that they share. And that's resulted in greater biodiversity on their farms. There's more wading birds, for example, and they've improved the soil condition, and they're collectively more resilient to extreme weather on their farm. And as a result of those farm clusters, we're looking at how we can improve our agricultural payment system to reward farmers for not only conserving species, but for creating new habitats and for working together collectively and cooperatively and sharing learning across the sector. So we're integrating policy outcomes into funding streams, and we're trying to support action that brings multiple benefits to biodiversity, climate risk, food production and flooding, and soil condition. So that's our experience in Scotland.
No, thank you, Susan. Your experience really reminds us that, as we were mentioning, ambition only becomes meaningful, again, when it's backed by institutions, by policy alignment, the partnerships, the capacity, the sustained investment, like the Nature Restoration Fund, and definitely proper accountability with society, bringing them all on board. So thank you so much for this example. And last but not least, Sabelo, if you could recommend one action that every city should implement before 2030 to accelerate this progress towards the GBF, what would it be and why? Over to you, Sabelo. You have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you once again, Eva. Yeah, I think again it's quite a great question, but also I think complex. I think really from the city of Durban's experience, what we are taking advantage of is really, I think, that land use in special planning space and language where we're integrating the environmental inputs and outcomes. And so really, I think for me, if there's one key message, I think for cities and local government is really, I think, to make use of the spatial and land use planning, really, I think, to advance biodiversity action at the local level. At least in the South African context, I think planning it's kind of like a forte of subnational or I suppose of local government. And so I would urge, I think, other cities to really take advantage of that space just because of how we are positioned. And really, I think for us, this really means that biodiversity is considered as part of land use planning, but also in terms of the decision making, like, using environmental information, at least the flow and the inputs of the environmental information is quite seamless. But I think in order also to do that effectively, as much as for us, for me, that is one key thing. I do think that this notion around advocacy, communication, and awareness is quite critical because you do need to then also to empower the planners, the project managers, the engineers that are planning infrastructure in the city so that they can then get to understand how to use all of this information where we are then able to guide them. But also in that regard, you cannot leave out the community as well as the landowners because at the end of the day, sometimes this is their land. Sometimes these land use decisions may affect their development aspirations unless they come along with you and they really fully understand what is the city's goal around biodiversity, that how they can maybe add value in terms of biodiversity action. So I think for me, the advocacy and communication is also then it's a secondary element which then makes your regulation from a land use and planning perspective, I think, a lot more easier. Just maybe the last point, I think, to support that, again, it's based out of some research which was done by one of our officials, where there are massive opportunities for us, really, I think, as a city of Durban to tap into. If you analyze our land use scheme in the different zones, there are some land use zones that we think are really compatible with biodiversity protection. They might not be called environment, they might not be called biodiversity zones, but we've done a level of analysis to understand where these zones are and where those are actually complementary. And so we want to, in fact, we're in the process of really looking at this and really to capture these as a way of when we are doing our annual reporting in terms of biodiversity that's protected and managed, also to include those spaces. So I think, yeah, research is another critical component that as local government we should not forget. But I think for me, the one key takeaway is it's really, I think, using spatial as well as a land use planning and the decision-making processes thereof as one of the critical aspects that local government should be implementing.
Thank you very much, Chabelo. These are many practical takeaways. I hope many cities today are listening, will take forward. I reiterate, spatial planning tools, but access and proper use of information, research, advocacy, and communication. You mentioned integration of communities and landowners to truly create this ownership and whole of society approaches. So thank you very much for your practical takeaways. So taking advantage of the fact we have a little bit more time today, I'd like to invite both Jade Sullivan and Ingrid to share a couple of thoughts with us. Jade, sorry to put you on the spot, but any words about the global review? As I know you served on the CBD's hashtag. Maybe a couple of minutes. I would also say 3 minutes for you, Jade, no more. But any thoughts now that we have privilege to have you here? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. From my side, I know that when we adopted the KMGBF in 2022, at the COP, it was also adopted a package that led or guided the global review mechanism. And I see Yvonne is putting up my slide. Thank you. So this comprised of a midterm review now at the 17th conference, and then a final review at the 19th one in 2030. Through this, there was decision 1632, which I'm sure Ingrid will tell you more about, where parties agreed on the process for conducting this global review. And from our side, as part of this process through Cities with Nature and Regions with Nature, which we talk about quite often, we shared the contributions from local and subnational governments into the CBD's clearinghouse mechanism as evidence for what is happening on the ground. This process has a period where we submit the data and then it goes to the parties' dashboards. So yeah, for us, it has been quite a feat to have local and subnational government's voice heard in this process. But as we have now seen the first draft of the global review report, we know that there's still a gap in this process. There's still a bit of there's a gap in the information available from cities and subnational governments, especially from what came out in the national reports. And because of this, we are also compiling a report mandated under Decision 1512 for local and subnational governments, where we are sort of compiling a case study compendium, if you may. And we hope to share the work that is happening on the ground for local and subnational governments in more of a qualitative format. And this case studies will align with the GBF targets and the action areas of the plan of action. And we hope to sort of add this to the information documents for the upcoming COP. We are still accepting case studies, and I'll share the link in the chat. And we hope to add more of the local and subnational governments' voices to this global review process. So yeah, that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much to you, Jade. And on your work submitting the input to the global review. So we're hearing from you, there's still a gap. You're still working hard on the compendium for local and subnational government inputs. So thank you for all that hard work. And also, Ingrid, we have you here. We still have some minutes. So any words about the CVD's review of the plan of action for cities and linking this up back to our conversation around national biodiversity strategies and action plans? Thank you, Ingrid. Over to you.
Thanks, and it's been really interesting listening to all these inputs. It's made me think about a lot of things, and I think it was Alyssa that referred to the Edinburgh process. And for those of you that don't know, Sue Campbell was very, very involved in that Edinburgh process. And one of the great things that came out of that process was this plan of action that the parties adopted in 2022, together with the Global Biodiversity Framework, around how to engage subnational governments. And one of the primary things, and this is something that you talked about right in the beginning around how important NBSAPs are, was that one of the things that this plan of action does is to link the NBSAPs with the KMGBF, but also the plans and the strategies that happen lower down at the subnational level. Sue referred to one, and also down at city level. So there's a really great sort of multi-level link between all of these things and how they collectively are intended to feed into achieving those global targets. Also in the plan of action, it talks about multi-level governance and partnerships. A lot of people have been talking about partnerships, and people have also been talking about capacity, resources, enabling, and then this whole notion of mainstreaming biodiversity. And you may recall that I said at the beginning that this webinar is part of the CBD's Communities of Practice on biodiversity mainstreaming. And I think this is a really great example of how these things come together at the different levels, from global all the way down to cities. And then, of course, very importantly, the thing about monitoring and reporting. So Cities with Nature and Regions with Nature are commitment and reporting platforms that they can use. And that was the data that we fed into the global review process. And if you look at the global review, I think what was really important there is that it goes beyond just what parties or national governments committed to and have taken action against. And it does recognize the contributions of whole of government and whole of society. I don't want to expand too much about that because Jade has given us that. But what the CBD has also done is it's come out now with a report that's going to be tabled at the intersessional meetings in August, and then also at COP, is looking at this plan of action. So how successful have we been as parties and subnational governments around the world in giving effect to this plan of action? And there has been great sort of progress made in some areas, keeping in mind that this is all voluntary. This is not like a target where you have to meet those targets. This is a voluntary process. It's not something that cities have to do or subnational governments have to do or the parties have to do. But there is still, I think, and it comes out in the report, although a lot of the countries, the parties are involving subnational governments, small towns, big towns, provinces, states, in their NBSAP processes, there's still a lot that can and should be done. We had a very interesting exercise here in South Africa about a month ago as part of the International Day of Biological Diversity, sort of the first ever global celebration. They organized what we call a Logotna, as a gathering together. They got the whole of society and the whole of government together for 2 days and debated and validated, because we're still in the process of refining our NBSAP. And what really stood out for me was that of the cities and subnational governments that were there, particularly at the municipal level, they all said, give us more. We want to do more. Give us more responsibility, more things to do, which I think is indicative of the ambition and the willingness and the understanding of how important it is that there's a lot that does happen and should happen at local level, and wanting to take on more responsibility. So really, I think that we're going to see in this report that comes out, yes, we've done a lot, but we haven't gone far enough And there will hopefully be some very constructive discussion on how do we close that action ambition between now and 2030. We still have time. We don't have a lot of time. And I really like those enablers, Alicia, that you mentioned about, the policy, regulatory and finance enabling environment, looking about the relevance. That's so important. If the finance manager understands why biodiversity is important, budgeting will become a whole different spectrum. And then helping access with resources. You talked about blended finance. There's some great examples. And then also about investing into building that capacity. And a very important one, we haven't really got to grips with it today, but it's super important, is this thing about data. How do we measure access to data and things? So thanks.
No, thank you so much, Ingrid, for shedding more light on the plan of action to engage national governments and its role connecting the NBSAPs and the plans at regional and city levels. Obviously, very encouraging to hear regional and local actors are excited and are asking for more ways to be engaged, although we all fully acknowledge there's a lot more to be done. So thank you. Well, with that, I'd like to go to our final round with our panel speakers. And for each of you, in 1 minute, I know it's tough, but we don't have a lot of time left. As we approach COP17 and the global review we've been discussing, what would success look like? And what is that signal the international community should be looking out for to know that we're genuinely closing the biodiversity implementation gap? So, Alisa, over to you, 1 minute.
Sure, thank you. And thanks for those comments, Ingrid and Jade. I think that added some really valuable context to the conversation. For me, a successful COP17 isn't going to be one where we can say every target is fully on track. I think we all can acknowledge that's not where we are. But a successful COP17 would be one where we can clearly demonstrate that the world is moving from, commitment and ambition into implementation and action. And these are the three signals that I would look for when trying to evaluate that transition. And the first is that evidence that biodiversity is becoming a whole of government priority, not just the responsibility of the environment ministries, but increasingly integrated into decisions on agriculture, infrastructure, finance, climate development. Are those folks at the table? Are we having those conversations? Second, we need stronger engagement from the whole of society and not just as an afterthought. Success requires coordinated action, not just from national governments, but also from cities, regions, businesses, Indigenous peoples, local communities, and civil society, getting everybody working to the same, walking to the beat of the same drum. Third, we need a stronger focus on enabling conditions, that policy coherence, finance, capacity, those partnerships that really allow action to happen at scale. And I'll be looking out for that in Yerevan in October. But ultimately, we're at the point now where we have an opportunity with the global review, not just to measure progress, but also to learn, adapt, and accelerate based on what we see in those findings. And if COP17 shows us that collective action is scaling up, if it's becoming more coordinated, then I think that's a good signal that we're starting to close the implementation gap and building that momentum we need towards 2030 goals.
Definitely. Very well put. Thank you, Alisa. Susan, over to you. 1 minute.
Thanks.
What does success look like? And
Thanks,
what is
Eva.
that signal?
Sure. I think success looks like an outcome where we're taking actions that deliver multiple benefits. So that might be for climate, for biodiversity, for food production, for flood risk reduction, thinking about what happens in a place. It's helpful, I think, to reframe the issue to addressing the risks or the thing that you want to happen in a place. What's the priority for that place? So it needs us, as Alisa has just outlined, it needs us to move away from working in silos. It needs us to adopt systems thinking, make room for communities, government, environmental organisations and individuals to speak to each other. We need to recognise that the solution to to a particular risk or for a particular place might not be within your own area, but it might be in another area. So, for example, in Scotland, we're encouraging upland peatland restoration to address downstream flooding. And we're taking catchment scale approaches in Scotland. Restoring upland peatland holds more rainwater. We're planting more trees to cool rivers and slow down and soak up water. We're re-wiggling rivers to create new wetlands. And we're planting seagrass to absorb storm waves. So there's it's a whole system that we need to think about. And we're looking at where our priorities are, what areas are most at risk, where do we need to make more effective use of public money, and how can our agencies work better together. And that really is what we need to have honest conversations about the risks, the climate risks in the future, what we need in a place in the future, and where nature can help us solve that issue, where we can improve biodiversity. And that'll bring the social and economic benefits to people and communities, as well as tackling biodiversity loss.
And thank you very much, Susan. A wonderful way to close your presentations. And Sabelo, over to you. 1 minute.
Yeah.
What do you want to share?
Yeah, thank you, Eva. Yeah, I think I agree. I think with the other panel members, just around, I think really all of us understanding the risks that might be associated with biodiversity, the need for partnerships. I think maybe from my perspective, maybe to start off to say, like, local government is really, I think, where action is. I think there's quite a lot of innovation, like, and also I think levels of excellence, especially in like your metropolitan municipalities, like in my organization. And I think for me, I do think that a successful COP outcome for me would be where local government is actually given the necessary support, clarity of mandates in terms of what they need to do, but also just around the human capital, as well as I think the financial resources, as well. I think for local governments to be given the necessary tools to be able to implement and to accelerate implementation. I think the tools will enable local government to integrate biodiversity planning in decision making, to ensure that, and I think in order to do that effectively, you do need, I think, dedicated officials that are suitably qualified and experienced to be able to do this sort of work. And I really think this is where national government can really play a supportive role, at least in the South African context. I think really to help us there to do that in an effective way.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sabelo, for these closing words. Really listening to today's discussion, I'm taking away 3 key messages. And the first is that implementation depends on a multi-level governance approach. So national, regional, and local governments each have distinct but complementary roles, and stronger coordination among them is essential. I also heard that biodiversity needs to be integrated into mainstream planning and decision-making. So success will depend on embedding biodiversity into finance and land use planning and infrastructure and public service delivery and investment. But third, and as external relations lead and partnerships lead for the accelerator, that partnerships matter. That achieving the global biodiversity framework requires collaboration across governments, cities, communities, farmers, organizations. And the partnerships and if I may say, that partnerships and platforms such as ICLE and my own, the NBSAP Accelerator Partnership, are key to help connect policy, technical expertise, and implementation support. So help with this articulation. But with that, I just want to thank all of you, our panelists, for sharing your insights and your experience and the passion with which you're delivering and helping deliver the GBF at a national and local level. Thank you, all of our colleagues who joined us today. And with that, Ingrid, I hand the session back over to you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Eva, for your excellent moderation. You've done it in a very calm way. I normally am not that calm. I really want to commend you. And I just want to say to our panelists also, as Eva has said, thank you so much. It's been really very, very valuable insights. We saw that there was a question in the chat box that we didn't have time for. It was talking about food and biodiversity and the sorts of initiatives that cities and subnationals are doing at that level. And I know there are many. I know both in Scotland and eThekwini, Sabelo, in your neck of the woods. But I just want to say as a last point, we have one last webinar in this series. It's going to take place on the 17th of September. We've had to change it. Those of you that may have already registered for it earlier in September, we've had to change it because it clashed with a very big KMGBF meeting. So at the request of the CBD Secretariat, we now made it on the 17th. Our registration system has been updated. Those of you that have registered, you will get a notification. Also just to say that for those of you that will still register, you will get you'll get the new date. The details aren't out yet. We will still do that. It's going to be a slightly longer one, 90 minutes, because we're going to be focusing on the COP. So that's going to be really saying we're now a month before COP. This is what you can expect. This is what we're going to be doing there. So that's going to be a really, really exciting one. We hope we will see you all and more there. So please let know your colleagues about this webinar. And just again, thank you to everybody. I see that Sue has just indicated that in Scotland, they are culling deer to reduce grazing pressures for biodiversity. And yeah, so there are many, many innovation solutions. So thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, or if it's the end of your day, thanks for being with us at the end of your day. And we'll see you hopefully on the 17th of September. Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you.